Dumb Husky and his white cat Shizun. Chapter 213. Mount Jiao Life and Death Battles. Although sect leader Zhang Ying was someone who had died a long time ago, there were many paintings of him that were passed down in the world. In the Hall of Sages of the Rufeng sect, there was even a dignified jade shrine of him. Therefore, upon seeing him, Ye Wangzi reacted almost instantly. "Si, quickly open the barrier. You can't beat him." Of course, he couldn't beat him. Who could beat him? Perhaps even the current most powerful grandmaster in the cultivation world, Chu Wanning, wouldn't have a chance of winning against him. Nangongsi was trembling, but it wasn't because he was afraid. Instead, it was because of an extremely intense grief and anger. Grand Sect Master Su Xuanglin had actually turned the Grand Sect Master's corpse into a Zhenlong chess piece. He's mad. He was absolutely mad. This was their ancestor, the soul of the Rufeng sect, the roots of the Rufeng sect. He was the god revered by generations of disciples and descendants for hundreds of years in the Rufeng sect. It was Nangong Zhangying. The veins on Nangongsi's neck bulged. He let out an extremely distorted roar, like a tiger roaring in the forest. "Su Xuanglin! No, Nangongsu! Come out! Come out!" His voice lingered for a long time like the cry of vulture. No one answered him. Of course, Su Xuanglin wouldn't come out. The only one who reacted was Nangong Zhangying, whose eyes were covered by the silk band. He slightly turned his face and his pale fingers slid across the scabbard. The treasured sword that had been buried with him came out of the scabbard. He held the sword and slowly walked down the step. At the same time, Nangongsi took a step back and muttered, "Grand Sect Leader." Nangong Zhangying's steps were steady. The tip of his sword tapped on the jade steps, making an ear-piercing scratching sound. His eyes were covered as the silk band was attached to his body after his death. It couldn't be removed, so he couldn't see the path in front of him. He could only rely on sound and smell to determine Nangongsi's position. "Who are you?" Suddenly, a low and ethereal voice sounded. It was Nangong Zhangying who spoke. "Why are you trespassing?" Hearing the ancestor of several hundred years speak, even if it was just a Zhenlong chess piece, was still extremely shocking. Nangongsi swallowed his saliva and said, "Grand Sect Leader, I." He suddenly let go of the sword he was holding and knelt down to kowtow. "This unworthy one is Nangongsi, the 7th generation direct disciple of the Rufeng sect. I have come to pay my respects." 7th generation. See. Zhangying's corpse slowly and numbly repeated these words. Then, he shook his head and raised his sword. He only said one word, "Kill." The two weapons clashed. With the attack of Nangong Zhangying, Nangongsi felt his arm go numb. The strength of his predecessor was really astonishing. His deathly pale face approached, and with his ice-cold breath he said, "All trespassers will be killed." Grand Sect Leader. Dazzling sword flower. The sword aura was both sharp and astonishing. When the iron blades collided with each other, sparks flew in all directions. Its color was like snow. Xue Zhenyang punched the barrier and said, "Are you crazy? How can you possibly beat him?" Who didn't know about Nangong Zhangying's capabilities? It was said that his strength was astonishing. Even if he didn't use a weapon, he could smash rocks into pieces with one hand. Deal with him? Perhaps even 10 Nangongsi wouldn't be a match with his ancestor. Nangongsi's mind was blank. He never thought that there would be a day when he would actually fight with the first sect leader of the Rufeng sect on Mount Qiao. When the two swords collided, he was suddenly pushed back 10 feet. If he hadn't supported himself with his sword in time, he would have been kneeling in a pile of weeds. Nangong Zhangying raised his sword and slowly approached again. He repeated the order in a low voice, "Kill." At this moment, outside the barrier, Xue Zhenyang was angrily hammering the barrier. Zhang Shi frowned but didn't say a word. Villa Master Ma simply covered his eyes and didn't dare to look. Huang Xiaoyu was secretly frightened and rejoiced. Fortunately, he didn't catch Nangongxi. If he had brought Nangongxi to Mount Jiao alone, he would have been the one facing the first sect leader of the Rufeng sect. It was only Chu Wanning who stared at Nangong Zhengying's actions without blinking. He felt that something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Who was Nangong Zhengying? Just look at the two evil beasts he subdued, one was a demonic dragon and the other was a gun. Both were ancient demonic beasts. There was no need to say how terrifying this person's spiritual power was. Even if at this time his soul had already left his body, leaving only a shell in the world. He couldn't use many spells, but his fighting skills shouldn't be affected. So, just how fierce was Nangong Zhengying's fighting skills? Far east near the Flying Flower Island, there was a relic left behind by the Rufeng sect, the Wind Gate, a lake on the island. This lake wasn't big, but it wasn't small either. It was stagnant water and didn't have any magnificent scenery. It would take about half an hour to walk around it at a leisurely pace. However, everyone knew that this lake wasn't originally a lake, but a small hill. During the fierce battle between Nangong Zhengying and the gun used this hill to hide and dodge several times. During the fierce battle, Nangong Zhengying punched the hill more than 10 times in a row. In the end, the last punch actually shattered 100 Zhonghai rock, causing it to break down and collapse. From then on, the mountain range was no longer there. The rain accumulated into a pool, and that was how this lake came to be. So, it wasn't that Chu Wanning looked down on Nangongxi, but he felt that when Nangong Zhengying's sword first met with Nangongxi's, Nangongxi should have flown 100 feet away with no chance of him being able to get up again. There was something was wrong with this corpse. Chu Wanning's eyes were like a sharp blade that scraped every inch of Nangong Zhengying's muscles and bones. Suddenly, his sharp eyes focused and fell on Nangong Zhengying's arm that held the sword. He paused, and in that instant, a spark lit up in his mind. He suddenly realized what was wrong. On the other side, Nangongxi was struggling to support himself with his sword. He staggered and stabilized himself. He was like his wolf dog. He could be defeated, but he definitely wouldn't run away. He used his sleeve to fiercely wipe the blood from the corner of his mouth. Just as he was about to fight again, he suddenly heard a familiar voice behind him. Hit his left side. The veins in his left arm are all broken. Grandmaster Chu. Don't be distracted. Chu Wanning stood outside the barrier, his pair of brown eyes staring at the two people who were fighting. Even if Nangong Zhengying's left arm is broken, you can't let your guard down. Hearing Chu Wanning's words, the surrounding masters all looked at Nangong Zhengying's left arm. Sure enough, they found that the corpse's left arm was soft and weak. Xue Zhenyang was shocked. Master Nangong Zhengying's meridians were broken after he died? Who did it? No one answered. But people like Ye Wangzi, who were familiar with Nangong Zhengying's life, quickly understood. Who did it? Who in this world would break his meridians? Who could break his meridians? While fighting with Nangong Zhengying, Nangongxi stared at his ancestor's face. The face was exactly the same as that of the jade statue in the Hall of Sages. It was as if Nangong Zhengying was still alive in this world and had never walked towards death. If he was really still alive, if he truly was not dead, and if these hundreds of years were written off, then at this moment, was he accepting the test of the first generation of masters, accepting his trial, accepting his guidance? Nao Beijin. Come here. Nangongxi's senses gradually returned to his body. He sternly called for the demon wolf and flipped over. He stared at Master Nangong Zhengying's left arm and attacked at an extremely fast speed. A scene of his childhood flashed before his eyes. He stood in front of the magnificent jade statue in the Hall of Sages, tilting his head to look at the statue of the first generation of masters. A child's perspective was always strange. He suddenly turned his head to Rongyan and said, "Mother, This statue is incomplete. How is it so? Rongyan dragged her luxurious robes and covered her mouth with a handkerchief. She lightly coughed and walked to the child's side. She looked up at the statue of Grandmaster Nangang Zhongying and said, "Isn't it very good? It's very detailed, very lifelike. I don't understand." Rongyan sighed. She was an impatient person. She hated that she could not shove the knowledge that other people had to spend 20 years to learn into her son's head in just 2 years. It means that it's carved like a living person. Every detail is very lifelike. Didn't I teach you these 2 words last time? Nangang Si curled his lips and said, "But it's carved wrong." "What's wrong with it?" "Mother, look." He pointed to the left arm of the first generation of masters, then pointed to the right arm. The left arm is 1 size thicker than the right arm. I've been staring at it for a long time. It's definitely carved with different thickness. It's not symmetrical at all. It's wrong, wrong. As he said that, he even raised both his arms to show Rongyan. He seriously reasoned with his mother, "My arms are the same thickness on both sides. Mother's arms are the same, father's arms are also the same. So, this sculpture is wrong. Let the craftsman redo it." So that's what Sier meant. Rongyan shook her head and said, "This is not the craftsman's fault. It's just that the Grand Master's left and right arms are not proportionate." "Why? Is that normal?" "Of course, it's not." Rongyan said, "The Grand Master's dominant hand was his left. The strength of his left arm is much greater than his right arm. After a long time, his left arm will gradually become thicker and stronger than his right arm. Therefore, the craftsman who carved the statue not only did not make a mistake, but also paid attention to these details." Clang! The 2 long swords faced each other. Nangang Si and Nangang Zhongying's faces were very close to each other. Separated by the sparks flying from their weapons, they gritted their teeth and fought against each other. Nangang Zhongying, who lost his left hand, was facing Nangang Si, who was heavily injured and exhausted. Xue Zhenyang had a thought that made him gasp: the meridians in his left arm, could it be that he broke them himself? In fact, it was not only Xue Zhenyang. Many people who were watching the battle outside the barrier also gradually had this thought in their minds. After the high-ranking disciples of the Rufeng sect were buried, their eyes had to be covered with a silk band with spiritual power. Was it really just for the sake of traveling on a crane, seeing the clouds and sky? Was it possible that Nangang Zhongying had more or less anticipated the changes that could happen after hundreds of years? Therefore, when he established the Rufeng sect, he had already thought of this catastrophe that could happen to Rufeng sect. The reason why he covered the eyes of every buried disciple was so that they would not be able to use their full spiritual strength after death, and thus preventing them from bringing disaster to the world. Therefore, the holy weapon that accompanied him when he was alive was not kept within his coffin. He only held a long sword. Thus, before he died, he cut off all the meridians in his left arm so that in the future, should there be a wicked person who used his corpse to stir up trouble, they would not be able to use his full fighting strength. However, the exact answer was still unknown. After more than 10 rounds of fighting, Nangang Si suddenly caught a glimpse of how the Grand Master's eyebrows knitted slightly. He muttered, "Nangang Si, 7th generation." Outside the barrier, Mo Ran stared at Nangang Zhongying's every move with rapt attention. As the Taxian Jun, his observation point was different from all the righteous people present. He could accurately perceive some things that people who had not played the Zhenlong chess formation would find difficult to immediately discover. From Mo Ran's point of view, this corpse was clearly different from the others. He seemed to have been struggling to regain his consciousness this entire time. This was also what Mo Ran was worried about before. Although the Zhenlong chess formation was one of the 3 great forbidden techniques, there was no such thing as a perfect spell in the world. If a person's willpower was particularly strong, then the caster would have to continuously exert spiritual power to suppress the chess piece's resistance. Once the caster's spiritual power was no longer enough to control the formation, the chess piece would go berserk and lose control. Sometimes it would even backfire on the caster. This was also why in the history of the Zhenlong chess formation, there were many people who suddenly died of a disease or directly reversed the flow of their meridians and died abruptly. Mo Ran's face was burning as his eyes followed Nangong Zhongying's movements. He was almost certain that Su Xuanglin could not completely control Nangong Zhongying. Bang! The sudden muffled sound made Mo Ran clench his 5 fingers on the barrier, his veins protruding. The difference in strength was too great. Everyone present clearly saw that even if Nangong Zhongying maimed his dominant arm and greatly reduced his strength, a great grandmaster was still a great grandmaster. Even when the sharp claws had been pulled out, this empty corpse could still fight evenly with Mei Hangxiu and Xue Meng. If they really wanted to suppress him, perhaps they would need the sect leader and the sect elders to make a move. But the sect leader and the elders could not enter the battlefield. The barrier was sealed and inside was the territory of the Nangong clan. If they rashly entered, it would cause the spirit of Mount Jiao to go berserk and further complicate the matter than it already was. At the moment, it was as if this matter was an internal conflict within the Rufeng sect where no one could interfere. If Nangong Si came into this battle with full health and full strength, then he would have a chance to deal with the corpse in front of him. However, he had already exhausted his strength and spiritual powers prior to it. Another heavy blow came. Nangong Si could have easily dodged, but when he grabbed Nao Beijin's collar and flipped onto his back, the wound on his palm was torn open, which momentarily caused him to lose strength and unable to hold on. Woo! Nao Beijin let out a mournful cry. The sword in Nangong Si's hand was knocked away and it rolled to the edge of the barrier. Mo Ran saw that the sword hilt was already stained with blood from Nangong Si's palm. Si! Don't fight anymore. Come out. Let's think of another way. Ye Wangzi shouted at him again. People were always like this. Ye Wangzi would not beg for mercy for herself, but Nangong Si was her weakness. She was begging and crying non-stop. Mo Ran had never seen her cry like this in his previous life. At this moment, she really had the shadow of a young woman. Nangong Lu and Nangong Su, these two brothers had selfishly put a resolute and cold mask on her face. She had always thought that she would never be able to take off this mask. However, the moment she saw the blood-stained sword, the mask turned to ashes. Si! This blow was too heavy. Nangong Si gritted his teeth as beads of sweat dripped down his forehead. He didn't utter a sound as he tried to force himself up from the ground. However, a cold light flashed past and a sharp blade as bright as snow shone on his face. Nangong Si slightly gasped for breath, and raised his face, which was slightly similar to Nangong Zhongying's, and stared at his ancestor through the dazzling sword light. Nangong Zhongying's sword was already hanging above him. Inside and outside the barrier, deathly silence reigned. End chapter. Dumb Husky and his white cat Shizun. Chapter 214. Mount Jiao Spirit Core Fragmentation. Mo Ran clenched his fists in secret. His heart beat like a war drum as the veins on his temples twitched. He stared at the tense situation in front of him, as a crazy thought roared in his mind. Nangong Zhongying could take Nangong Si's life at any time. But would he really do nothing about it? Could he simply stand there just like that? He was trembling. He was suffering, but fortunately, no one saw anything strange about him. The line between life and death in the barrier was like fine sand absorbing water, and everyone's gaze was focused on it. The sharp sword could be stained with blood at any time. Thousands of trees rustled. Mo Ran gripped the hidden weapon in his sleeve, his fingers stroking the edge of the sharp arrow. He wanted to do something, but that something made his fear grow like wild weeds. Suddenly, Nangong Zhongying's body trembled. The trembling was too obvious that everyone could see it clearly. Xue Zhenyang was shocked. What's happening? Nangong Zhengying couldn't see Nangongxi's specific position, and the position where he raised his sword was a bit off. However, Nangongxi couldn't make a sound. Even the slightest sound or movement of the wind could make Nangong Zhengying react. He stared at his ancestor's face with a pale but stubborn expression and pursed his lips. The corners of his lips were full of blood that hadn't dried yet. You are Nangong. See. This time, not only Xue Zhenyang, but many people standing in front of him who heard the sentence also shivered. Nangong Zhengying had broken out of the forbidden spell's control. Mo Ran's expression also changed. A cold light flashed in his sleeve and he put away the concealed arrow that he was intending to use. His back was already soaked in cold sweat while his heart was beating wildly. That was close, he was almost exposed. He felt lucky that he didn't have to make a move, but then he felt uneasy and disgusted by his own luck. In front of this Mount Xiao, the two spirits of his past life and present life were fighting fiercely. They kept biting and tangling, tearing at each other until blood was dripping and flesh was badly mangled. He didn't know how long he could hold on. Nangong. C. 7th. Within the barrier, Nangong Zhengying's sword, which was hanging high in the air, was slowly shifting. Little by little, inch by inch. Xue Zhenyang was extremely shocked. Does he really have consciousness? No, he hasn't fully broken out of the forbidden spell's control yet. He was fighting for consciousness, slowly restoring the remnant consciousness of this corpse. Mo Ran knew that Su Xuanglin was hiding in a corner of Mount Xiao, like a clumsy puppeteer. He had never danced with such a complicated and powerful puppet before. He could not hold on any longer. Nangong Zhengying was about to break free of his swoosh. Before Mo Ran could finish his thoughts, a muffled sound of flesh being pierced rang out, causing his scalp to go numb and his pupils to contract. In that instant, blood splattered everywhere. After a moment of silence, an extremely distorted scream suddenly exploded in Mo Ran's ears. It was like a cold sword pierced through his bones. Ah si. Miss Yet. Ye Wangzi. They held down Ye Wangzi, whose eyes were red and whose expression was almost crazy. They were afraid that she would do something extreme, but they soon realized that it was unnecessary. What could she do? She was not a member of the Nangong family. No matter how good she was, as far as the spirit of Mount Jiao was concerned, she was just an outsider. She could not enter the barrier at all. Nangong Zhengying's sword mercilessly pierced through Nangongxi's back and shoulder. If he could see with his own eyes, he was afraid that right now there would be a gaping hole in Nangongxi's chest. Nangongxi froze for a moment and seemed to want to say something, but Nangong Zhengying immediately pulled out his sword and blood splattered everywhere. Nangongxi, who fell to the ground, vomited a mouthful of blood. He could not even support himself anymore. After struggling a few times, he finally collapsed into the mud. Mo Ran did not know what Su Xuanglin did. Perhaps he sacrificed the power of his spiritual core, or perhaps he used all of his consciousness to firmly control Nangong Zhengying. The body that was about to recover its spiritual awareness suddenly turned into a puppet again that killed decisively. He held the sword as blood dripped from the thin blade. The blood dripped onto the ground, and under the moonlight, it converged into a small pool of darkness that was uncertain whether it was dark or bright. Nangongxi once again tried to crawl up from the ground, but failed. In the mud, he barely managed to raise his face. Mo Ran's eyelashes trembled as he closed his eyes. He would rather Nangongxi not let anyone see this face of his. His originally proud, arrogant, clean, and handsome face was now only covered in blood and mud. His facial features were almost indistinguishable. He was in such a sorry state that it was enough to make anyone with a conscience feel sorrowful. Despite of it all, Nangongxi's eyes were not sad at all. There was still fire in his eyes, there was still light in them. Nangong Zhengying wanted to strike again, but a white light rushed over and tangled with him. Nao Beijing roared and howled, full of murderous intent, and did not care about anything else. Si. Ye Wangzi was on the verge of collapse, but Nangongxi did not look at her. He only stared at Jiangxi, as his bloody lips opened and closed. At this moment, he could not talk too loud, but Jiangxi knew lip reading. He clasped his hands behind his back as his brown eyes stared unblinkingly at Nangongxi's moving lips. Nangongxi finished speaking. Jiangxi said, "All right. I understand. Wu." With another dull bang, Nao Beijing was hit by Nangong Zhongying with one hand. Its fall was much louder than its master's, and its snow-white body fell among the trees, crushing a large number of branches and leaves. Immediately after, its spiritual power could not support it, and a cloud of smoke rose from the ground. Before the smoke dispersed, a fluffy white puppy rushed out. It was not even the size of a person's palm, and it used all its strength to bite Nangong Zhongying's clothes. It was Nao Beijing's form without spiritual enhancement. Nangongxi turned his head and coughed softly. Go quickly. Aou. Nao Beijing did not leave. However, its little bit of strength was like a clay ox entering the sea when it bit Nangong Zhongying. Nangong Zhongying did not even bother to pay attention to it. He moved his fingers and the ground of Mount Jiao trembled. The thousands of corpses that Nangongxi had previously tied up were instantly pulled out of the ground by vines. He had the strength to pull up mountains. He was unstoppable. Nangongxi's eyes flashed with a fierce light. He also pressed his hand hard on the ground. In an instant, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. His spirit core was shattering. He used his spirit core, which he had painstakingly cultivated for more than 20 years, and the blood that he had trained with for more 20 years, to risk everything and never look back. He shouted with blood in his eyes, "Sink!" Crack! He could clearly feel that the spirit core that had accompanied him for 20 years had cracked instantly. It was very light, like the ripples of a spring lake blown by the wind. At the same time, it was very heavy, like the rolling stones of a broken mountain. In the end, it turned into fine powder. At that moment, Nangongxi vaguely felt a sense of relief. So, this was what it felt like to have one's spiritual core crushed? Although it was painful, it was not a heart-wrenching pain. Then, when his mother died, she probably did not suffer too much. In just a moment, there was nothing left. The evil dragon's spirit actually trembled slightly because of his sacrifice. The blood vines that were about to let go suddenly closed again and clung tightly to the fierce corpses that were about to break out. Nangong Zhongying slightly raised his chin and said in a low voice, Then, he walked towards Nangongxi and stood in front of him. Nangongxi could not move at all. Without his spirit core, he was no different from an ordinary mortal. He couldn't even summon back his sword. He gasped for breath and looked up. His eyes reflected the moonlight, as well as Nangong Zhongying's face against the light of the moon. Grand Sect Leader. Nangong Zhongying's blindfold ribbon fluttered in the cold wind. He stood on the spot for a while before moving his finger again. However, due to the sacrifice of Nangongxi's spirit core, the spirit of Mount Jiao couldn't immediately respond to the command of its original master's corpse. Thus, the blood vines didn't move at all. In fact, they even slowly dragged the rampaging corpses and continued to sink them underground. However, Nangongxi knew that he could not hold on much longer. As long as Nangong Zhongying had the heart to give the order, Mount Jiao would definitely listen to its first master's orders. He could not change anything. However, even though he couldn't change it, he would still pay the price to do it. He would still try his best to do it. He had a clear conscience. Outside the barrier, Moran gritted his teeth. The arrow in his sleeve was at his fingertips again. The lines on his face were extremely tense. His hands were slightly trembling under his robes. Inside the barrier, Nangongxi said, "Grand Sect Leader. I'm sorry. I still, didn't manage to do anything. The ancestor's sword was raised again. Nangongsi slowly closed his eyes. Suddenly, just as he was about to be killed, he saw Nangong Zhengying turn his neck. With difficulty, he squeezed out a sentence from between clenched teeth. You are called Nangong. Si. Nangongsi suddenly trembled. He said hoarsely, Grand Sect Leader. You've gained awareness. Can you understand what I'm saying? Mo Ran could not hear the rest of the sentence clearly. However, everyone could see that Nangong Zhengying's hand suddenly slowed down. His lips moved slightly. It was obvious that he was talking to Nangongsi. I shouldn't fight with you. Nangong Zhengying's sword was still hanging in the air. However, his throat was intermittently making very soft sounds. My heart still has memories of the past. Before I died, I was worried that there would be changes in the future. He had just recovered his consciousness. His words were not clear as he spoke hoarsely. I didn't expect that such a day would really come. Nangong Zhengying paused for a moment. He continued, Nangong. See. Later, after I finish chanting the incantation, you immediately take the bow and arrow. Bow and arrow? What bow and arrow? Nangongsi's mind was buzzing. He did not react for a moment. However, Nangong Zhengying had already turned his long sword. With a whoosh, it scraped against the ground. He let out a long roar like a dragon's cry. Then, he moved back a few feet. His clothes fluttered in the wind. He looked like a banished immortal. Nangong Zhengying was trembling. At this moment, he was barely able to free his lips and tongue from the spellcaster's control. Every word he said required a lot of energy. Appear, Cloud Piercer. After he said the sentence word by word, a clear and melodious cry suddenly came from the heart of Mount Qiao. The ground in front of Nangongsi suddenly split open. Amidst the rolling stone and soil, a deep blue hornbow continuously sprang out, illuminated by the endless night. Everyone got frightened. Even someone as unruffled as Chu Wanning slightly changed his expression. The legendary holy weapon that accompanied the first sect leader of the Rufeng sect, Cloud Piercer. Quickly, take it away. Nangong Zhengying said hoarsely. His hands trembled violently, as if he was resisting an invisible spider web. He did his best to not go forward and take his divine bow, Cloud Piercer. Cloud Piercer's arrow can burn flesh and blood, burn. Nangongsi actually already understood what he meant. However, this was too much for him. He could not believe it. So, he opened his mouth and asked hoarsely, burn what? Me. Nangong Zhengying suddenly roared in anger. Grand Sect Leader. Don't let my corpse do the thing that I hated the most when I was alive. Nangong Zhengying stood tall and proud, his robes fluttering in the wind. He left behind his last word after hundreds of years, burn me. End chapter. Dumb Husky and his white cat Shizun. Chapter 215. Mount Qiao incineration of body remnants. For thousands of years, there had been many heroes in the cultivation world. However, there were only 10 people who were highly revered on the list of immortals, and Nangong Zhengying was one of them. In the past, Mo Ran did not think much of it. He once crushed the 72 cities of Rufeng sect with just his little finger. He only thought that there were hundreds of useless people hiding in their so-called immortal city. Before the knife was even placed on their necks, they began to cry in pain. Before they were cut by the sword, they were begging for mercy. Just like what he said before Ye Wangzi died in his previous life, in the 72 cities of the Rufeng sect, there was not a single man. In Mo Ran's eyes then, Rufeng sect was a plate of loose sand, and this Nangong Zhengying who gathered this plate of loose sand, what kind of great person could he be? Bloodstains were everywhere and the foundation of 100 years was razed to the ground by the latecomers in an instant. There were dead bodies everywhere as crows were pecking at the stomachs of the dead people. That year, the emperor, Taxian Jun, walked up the stairs. There was no expression on his face as he pushed open the door of the Hall of Sages. He wore a black cloak that reached the ground and walked through the long corridor where the portraits of previous leader and elders of Rufeng sect were displayed. He finally stopped at the end of the Hall of Sages. Taxian Jun raised his head. He was wearing a cloak and under the hood, his entire face couldn't be seen clearly. Only his pale chin was visible as it was arched fiercely and arrogantly. He raised his head slightly and sized up the statue that was taller than a real person in an inquiring manner. It was a statue carved with white jade spirit stone. It depicted a young immortal wearing a wide robe and wide sleeves. He stood in the air with a bow in his hand. The craftsman's strokes were strong and skillful. The eyes were inlaid with crystal stones, and the clothes were smeared with crystal sand. The bloody smell of the morning sun shone through the decorative skylight behind the statue, making him look like a banished immortal soaking in the divine light of the 9 heavens. Half of Taxian Jun's face under the hood suddenly showed a smile, revealing his white teeth and sweet dimples. He tidied up his clothes and bowed deeply. Then he raised his handsome face and said with a smile, "I've heard a lot about you, immortal Nangong." Naturally, the statue could not speak. Only the pair of black crystals glowed, as if they were staring at the person who had just arrived. Taxian Jun was extremely bored. No one paid any attention to him, but he was still able to act happily for a long time. "Junior Mo Weiyu is honored to meet you today. Immortal Elder Nangong sure is impressive." He talked for a long time, laughing and taking animatedly by himself. It looked as if a mad person was in front of a statue. "I've seen your great. He counted with his fingers and then sighed. "I can't count clearly. Who knows which generation of your nephews he is? I've seen who knows which generation of your nephews he is, and who knows which generation of your disciples he is." Then, he smiled brightly and said, "But now, they have all become ghosts under my blade, so if you haven't reincarnated yet, you have probably seen them already. It's a pity that I didn't see your great-grandson. That guy ran away before the city was breached. I don't know if he's dead or alive. It's a bit of a pity." He happily chatted with the statue for a while. Then, he said, "Oh right, I heard that immortal Nangong was also an outstanding person of his generation. It was said that everywhere you went, there were people who swore loyalty to you, that there were even people who supported immortal Nangong and claimed that he could be an emperor." Mo Ran smiled and said, "Isn't that as impressive as I am today? I know, everything I've said before was all nonsense. Seriously, I just have a question. Why did immortal Nangong refuse to ascend back then?" He paused and then walked forward a few steps. At this time, his eyes fell on the tablet behind the statue of Nangong Zhongying. In fact, this tablet was so big that he had seen it a long time ago, but he deliberately ignored it. The tablet was carved by Nangong Zhongying at the age of 96 with a sword. It was originally simple and unadorned, but later on, it was dyed with gold by the later generations of the Nangong family that now it shone so brightly, with each word costing about 1,000 gold taels. Mo Ran stared at it for a while, then said with a smile, "Oh, I understand. Greed, resentment, deceit, murder, rape, and plunder, are the things that I, a cultivator of Rufeng sect, can't do. Immortal Elder really has a strong character." He stood with his hands behind his back and continued, "But Immortal Elder lived a bright life with a pure reputation. You also earnestly taught your descendants until your death. But I'm very curious, did Immortal Elder ever expect that one day, the Rufeng sect would become like?" As he spoke, he pursed his lips as if he was thinking of a suitable word to describe it. Then, he thought of something. He then clapped his hands and said with a smile, "A nest of rats." After he finished speaking, he laughed out loud. He laughed heartily and wildly, purely and evilly. It echoed in the silent and solemn hall of sages for a long time. His voice was like ripping silk, as if it wanted to tear apart the scroll paintings that swayed slightly in the wind, to destroy the portraits of the heroes of the Rufeng sect of the past. That laughter finally stopped abruptly in front of Nangong Zhongying's ice-cold sculpture. Mo Ran no longer laughed. He restrained his smile and a layer of ice slowly condensed on his face. His dark eyes stared at the visage of the previous Grand Master in front of him. He stared at the person who was like him, who could also command the world and trample all the cultivators. It was as if time and space were intersecting, and the foremost cultivators of the two eras were confronting each other in the torrent of time. In the end, Mo Ran said softly, "Nangong Zhongying, your Rufeng sect is a pool of dirty water. I don't believe that you are untainted." He suddenly waved his sleeves, turned around and strode out of the hall of sages. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew off the hood of his cloak and finally revealed the face of the crazed immortal emperor, Taxian Jun. He had the best facial features in the world and was fully deserving of the title of a handsome man. However, this face was full of vicious and sinister gaze that was second to none in the world, akin to that of a vulture on a hunt for flesh. His black robe was like a thick cloud of ink, rolling down the long stairs. He was an evil spirit stalking the human world, the Azura of the mortal world. He looked around and saw the corpses of the disciples of the Rufeng sect everywhere. Some of them were missing arms and legs. Taxian Jun did not take any prisoner. Aside from the woman surnamed Song whom he had spared, the rest were all killed. At that moment, Mo Ran's heart gave birth to an extremely cruel joy. He looked at the gorgeous morning clouds in the sky. The rising sun pierced through the clouds and a dazzling golden light shone on his pale face. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath and clenched his hands in his sleeves. He was slightly trembling because of ecstasy and excitement. He used to be a person whose life was worthless. When he was young, he used to beg for food in Linyi. Back then, he watched his mother starve to death. He didn't even have a straw mat to wrap her body in. At that time, he asked a cultivator of the Rufeng sect if he could get him a coffin, the thinnest and cheapest one would be fine. However, that person only ridiculed him by saying, "What kind of person should be matched with what kind of coffin? Her life was worth only 3 feet long, you can't ask for 10 feet. There was nothing he could do about the coffin, so he just wanted to bury his mother on the spot. However, Linyi was strictly controlled. The nearest mass grave was outside of Daecheng City and it could only be reached after crossing 2 hills. He dragged his mother's body, and along the way, he received disgusted, disdainful, surprised and sympathetic gazes. However, no one extended a helping hand to him. He walked for 14 days. A child dragging a woman's body. 14 days. 14 days. Not a single person was willing to help him. At first, he would kneel on the side of the road and beg, pleading with passers-by, coachmen, and farmers to give him and his mother a ride on a wooden cart. But who would be willing to put a body of a stranger on their cart? Later, he stopped pleading. He just gritted his teeth and dragged his mother, walking step by step. The body stiffened, softened, and began to rot. A foul stench and corpse fluid seeped out. All the passers-by stayed 3 feet away from him, covering their noses and rushing away from him. On the 14th day, he finally arrived at the mass grave. By that time, he no longer smelled as if he was still amongst the living. The stench of the corpse had pervaded his bones. He didn't have a pick, so he used his hands to dig a shallow hole under the mass grave. However, he really didn't have the strength to dig a deep hole for her. He dragged his mother, who had rotted beyond recognition by this time, into the shallow hole. Then he sat beside her in a daze. After a long time, he said stiffly, "Mother, I should bury you now." He began to scoop up dirt and only managed to sprinkle some soil on his mother's chest when he collapsed and cried bitterly. It was strange. He thought that his tears had already dried up. No, no, no. If I bury you, I won't see you anymore. If I bury you, I can't be with you anymore. He crawled back into the hole and lay on top of the rotting body, crying. When his emotions calmed down, he went to scoop up dirt again. But the dirt seemed to have some kind of smell that could open up people's tear ducts. He was utterly defeated again. Why is it all rotten like this? It's all rotten like this. Why isn't there even a mat? Mother! Mother! He rubbed his face against her. He didn't despise her for being dirty. She smelled bad. She was dead. She didn't have a single piece of skin on her body anymore. She was bleeding with pus, with maggots crawling all over her body. He lay in her arms and cried bitterly. He choked and sobbed. Every sound seemed to be dug out from his throat, stained with blood. In the end, the mass grave echoed with his wail. That voice was distorted, hoarse and unclear. Sometimes it sounded like a person's cry, but more often it sounded like the wail of a cub who had lost its mother. Mother! Mother! Someone please come! Is there anyone? Can someone come and bury me too? Bury me too! In the blink of an eye, 20 years had passed. Mo Ran returned to Linyi. He stood on top of the jade-tiled pavilion of the Rufeng sect, standing in front of the mountain of corpses and the sea of blood. The young cub who reeked of corpses back then had become brightly furred and had grown sharp fangs. He opened his eyes again. His pupils flashed with a craze and intense brilliance. Today, he stood here. Who would dare to say to him that you can't get 10 feet? Ridiculous. He wanted 10 feet, 1,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 10 million feet. He wanted them all. He wanted everyone in this mortal world to kneel down and rub their knees on the ground. He wanted them to kneel down and present his 10,000 feet, 10 million feet. Trampled on all cultivators and rule the world. He entered the Hall of Sages and saw the statue of Nangong Zhongying. He became more and more certain of his own desires and ambitions. Yes, trample all the cultivators and rule the world. He could grasp everything in the palm of his hand. He would no longer be the child who cried bitterly while holding a corpse. He would no longer let the people he loved die in front of him. He would no longer let them rot in front of him, nor watch their skin turned into white bones and their beauty decayed into mud. 100 years later, he would also become a deity like Nangong Zhongying. He would be worshipped by people, admired by the high mountains, with white jade as his body and gold embellishment on his calligraphy. No, he would be better than the Nangong Zhongying. His legacy would be far better than the Rufeng sect. And he, the first emperor of the cultivation world, would be more admirable and praiseworthy than Nangong Zhongying, a hypocrite who could not be put down. Sin. He didn't believe that Nangong Zhongying didn't have any sin. How could a person who could create a monster like the Rufeng sect be a righteous and noble gentleman who sacrificed himself for justice? Wasn't it just because he left this greed, resentment, deceit, murder, rape, and plunder are the things that I, a disciple of Rufeng sect, mustn't do? Who didn't know how to say a few beautiful words? Before Mo Weiyu died, he could find someone to come up with some brilliant and admirable words of exaltation for him, find someone who would flatter him and write history book for him. The darkness of the past would be written off. From then on, he, Taxian Jun, would also become a revered master of all arts and a hero of the common people. It was really wonderful. There was no better ending than this. Greed, resentment, murder, rape, and plunder, is my, disciple of, mustn't do. A faint murmur exploded in his ears like a clap of thunder. Mo Ran abruptly pulled himself out from the swamp of memories. However, his eyes were still filled with chaotic sparks. He raised his head to look at Nangong Zhongying, whose chest had already been pierced through by Cloud-Piercer's arrow. His face was the same as the face of the jade sculpture from back then. Someone cried out in alarm, Nangong Si was injured that extensively. How could he pull the cloud-piercer bow? Was that bow prepared in advance? Look, there's spiritual energy attached to the bow. It's not Nangong sees. It's. No one could say anything else anymore. However, everyone was well aware. The spiritual energy was that of Nangong Zhongying's. The only person who could control the cloud-piercer divine bow was Nangong Zhongying. That was the spiritual energy left by Nangong Zhongying on the bow before he died. The fire quickly spread and burned Nangong Zhongying's chest. The cloud-piercer's arrow pierced his heart and the fire instantly spread to his whole body. But the corpse did not feel any pain. Nangong Zhongying's body looked so tall and dignified despite the fire. His face was so peaceful and calm, completely unperturbed. Mo Ran heard Xue Zhenyang murmured, had he expected this? Did he foresee such a day? No. It could not have been predicted. This was just a coincidence. Mo Ran was stunned. His pupils twisted into two thin slits. This was just a coincidence. But how could he convince himself? The ability to break free from the control of the Zhenlong chess formation, the broken meridians, the holy weapon cloud-piercer that was buried in Mount Jiao and the arrow that was filled with his very own spiritual energy. If it was not carefully planned, how could things turn out to this extent? He staggered a step back. He used to think that they were the same. He had thought that all the legendary heroes were born with the ability to cover the sky with their hands, that could wipe away the stains of their life, that could put on a clean shroud and left behind a trail of pure white. He thought that Nangong Zhongying was the same as the men from Rufeng sect, nothing more than appearances, that they were all evil beasts wearing human skin masks. He looked at Nangong Zhongying, who was now wrapped in the brilliant fire. Hundreds of years ago, he was like him, a cultivator who had amazing spiritual energy and the ability to penetrate the heaven and earth. Was he wrong? Nothing could drown out sins. No matter how dignified the official history was, there would always be flaws that could not be justified. Long tongues could never be stopped. The story told that Nangong Zhongying was a kind person. He refused to be a tyrant and did not ascend. He used to think that it was just a disguise, a pretense by someone at the peak of power. Was he wrong? Nothing could completely hide the truth, just like how the snow that had been deposited for a winter would melt. After the vast whiteness faded away, the earth would be bare and ridged. All the dirt hidden on the ground would have nowhere to hide. When the sun shone, they would be screamed in the light of day. Was he wrong? Mo Ran slowly shook his head as he continued to stare at Nangong Zhongying. Nangong Zhongying also raised his face. His eyes were still covered by the black silk band embroidered with the soaring dragon. No one could see his eyes, not even Mo Ran. Mo Ran did not know if it was his own illusion, but he felt that Nangong Zhongying seemed to be smiling. Under the black silk band, there were laughter lines. Fire could not burn it and water could not wash it away. Nothing could hide the faint traces of laughter. He stood quietly in the sea of fire, in the warm light. If he could, Nangong Zhongying also wanted to be selfish for once. He wanted to leave this broken body to accompany the green mountains and cypresses, and to be a hero in the future. The world was too beautiful. No one wanted to leave. However, he also knew that one day, he would have no choice but to go. So, he had already planned to break the veins in his left arm and hide the bow with his spiritual energy. He did not want his body to be used by others in the future. The world was too beautiful. It was enough to have flowers on it. It should not be stained with blood. Grand Sect Leader Nangong Si held the holy weapon Cloud Piercer and knelt on the ground. The light of the fire illuminated his young face, as well as the traces of tears on it. This descendant was unfilial. The fire from the bow of Cloud Piercer burned away the Zhenlong chess piece in Nangong Zhongying's body. He was about to be burned to ashes. His whole body became fainter and fainter in the light of the fire. Nangong Zhongying, who had completely regained his awareness, asked Nangong-si, "How many years has it been since the Rufeng sect was established?" He was only a corpse. His soul was no longer there. There were not many memories and consciousness left in the body, so he could only ask such a simple question. Nangong-si did not dare to be negligent. He answered with a choked voice, "The Rufeng sect was established 421 years ago." Nangong Zhongying tilted his head. This time, the smile was clearly visible at the corners of his mouth. He said, "It's been a long time." His voice was faint, like a cold wind passing through the mountain forest, dispersing without a trace. "I originally thought that it would end in 200 years. Nangong Zhongying's voice was gentle and rich, flowing through the grass on Mount Xiao. "All things in the world have a lifespan. When their lifespan is up, no one can continue it. Besides, there will be a day when the aged will be replaced by the youth. There will be a day when the old will be replaced by a new one. Anything that is used for a long time will become dirty and old. Someone will throw it away and replace it. This is a good thing. Sire, you don't need to blame yourself." Nangong-si suddenly raised his head. Because he had lost too much blood, his face was as white as a sheet of paper. His voice trembled slightly. "Grand sect leader. Actually, how long the Rufeng sect has existed does not depend on how many years it has been established or how many disciples it has." Nangong Zhongying's figure was almost fading away and his voice was getting more and more faint. "It depends on whether there are still people in this world who remember that greed, resentment, deceit, murder, rape, and plunder are the things that a cultivator of Rufeng sect cannot do." As he spoke, he gently waved his sleeve. In an instant, the grass on Mount Jiao shook and vines rose from all directions, sinking the corpses that were about to escape into the depths of the earth. "As long as you remember and abide by this creed, then you have fulfilled your duty." After saying this, Nangong Zhongying's body suddenly broke into pieces in the raging fire, turning into specks of firefly powder. The golden red starlight drifted in the vast mountain forest. His body had disappeared, but his voice did not disperse. Inside the barrier, Nangong-si had long been sobbing. Outside the barrier, Ye Wangzi had already knelt down. One after another, the gathered people began to kneel down. Immortal Nangong in life and in death, was a hero through and through. End chapter.